Good morning, this is Allison Pena with Worldwide ERC. Thanks to everyone for connecting, and welcome to today's webinar program, Relocating Securely, Keeping Data Secure When It's Most Vulnerable During a Relocation, sponsored by CapRelo. Before we begin, please take a moment to review Worldwide ERC's webinar disclaimer. And now I would like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. If you are experiencing technical difficulties joining the WebEx session today, please dial 866-779-3239 from the U.S. Email questions may be sent to support@webex.com. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online at any time. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A tab, which is located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Simply click on the tab and type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of the screen, and then click the Send button. Please note that all written questions selected during this webinar will be answered publicly. We do expect a high volume of questions and will attempt to answer as many as possible. A link to this handout will be included in an email scheduled to go out later this afternoon. Please be on the lookout for it. It will come to you from messenger@webex.com. During this webinar, we will be polling the audience at times. When a poll is opened, it will appear in the polling dialog box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen below the Q&A box. The question will appear in both the slide and polling dialog box. Simply select your answer and click Submit. The results will display in the same dialog box once the poll is closed. Please note that your answers will remain anonymous. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 CRP and 1 GMS credit. If you hold your CRP designation and would like to receive credit for this webinar, you will need to use the CRP Credits Management portal, which may be linked to from your profile page after logging into the Worldwide ERC website. The seminar ID for today's session is 15782. If you are a GMS seeking CE credit for this webinar, you must include the name and date of this event on your GMS renewal application at the time you apply for recertification. The renewal application is available online. HRCI information is noted here for the live event only. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Jim St. Clair is a veteran and former naval officer, currently serves as the Chief Technology Officer for the Dinocrates Group. He has over 20 years of experience in the data security arena and helps clients understand and adopt the latest advances in technology and processes, including blockchain, robotic process automation, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Paul McCullough has served as Chief Information Officer for JK Moving Services and CapRelo Global Mobility Management for over 12 years. He manages a team that supports over 800 users across multiple countries and has designed systems to enhance the client experience with custom logistics and mobility solutions. I'm delighted to welcome Paul and Jim to the program today. Thank you all for joining us. I will now turn the program over to Paul.
Great. Thank you, Allison. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. Welcome to Relocating Securely, keeping data secure when it's at its most vulnerable, which is during a relocation. As Allison indicated, joining me is Jim St. Clair, and Jim is CTO for Dinocrates, and Jim and I have worked together for over a year now, exploring solutions to better the security around the RMC world where I live. And, we've come up with what we think is a really nice overall picture today of, the threat landscape, how people, process, and new technologies all merge into keeping things secure. Let me grab control here, Allison, and get our slides in line. As I said, the agenda here is covering these 4 basic areas. We're going to have polling questions throughout today's presentation, and I encourage everybody to participate there, as well as opening up the Q&A at the very end of the presentation. So our first polling question, which I'd like everybody to answer if they can, revolves around email phishing. And email phishing is really probably the most common, what we term a threat vector to any organization, be they an RMC, a supply chain partner, or one of our clients. And we're curious as to, out in the audience, how often are people receiving phishing threats? And it's a bit of a trick question because phishing threats a lot of times are disguised, and you may not even know you're getting them. And we can talk about that a little bit. So please be encouraged to answer the poll. Jim, if you could add some color to just what the threat landscape looks like, and what are some of the recent statistics on data breaches, especially as they relate to using phishing as a way to get into organizations.
Absolutely, Paul. And again, I'd also like to say thank you very much for everyone attending today, and thank you for the opportunity to co-present with you. It's been very interesting and exciting to be able to work within the relocation community and establish some new ideas on standards and dealing with today's security threats. As you mentioned with regards to the threat landscape, there have been a number of studies, and if you have a chance to ever see the Verizon threat report, which is available on their website, that shows trends around information security that I think are really pertinent for our discussion today. First of all, the idea that over 38% of global organizations claim they're prepared to handle cyber attacks. But in fact, the numbers indicate that 95% of cybersecurity breaches, as they're detected, are really due to human error. There's been a general, I believe, cultural impression going back for many years that hackers focus in on high-value targets only and involve folks in their basement drinking a bunch of Mountain Dew. And in fact, the general trend has been pointed out that well over half involve either known organized criminal organizations, cyber criminal organizations, or nation states. Additionally, 36% of compromised data, both in 2017 and in the recent 2019 Verizon report, involve personal information, just like the kind being used in relocation information on a daily basis. And that the attack vector, as we like to refer to it, the main way of trying to penetrate the castle and compromise the moat and the fences typically is through email, with 93% of malicious software attacks coming through email, as pointed out in the Verizon studies. Most of the challenges are around configuration of email and understanding policies and procedures and standards. And one thing that's pointed out on the slide is that the dependency in your supply chain around knowing who your vendors are and your vendor's vendor are complicate the ability to make sure that these processes and procedures are in place to secure your information. Paul, I'll turn it back to you if there's anything you wanted to add there as well, sir.
Yes, I think it really is a multi-layer issue. What we're seeing now in terms of phishing are really more spear phishing attacks where the threat actor is trying to understand everything they can about people within your organization, and a lot of times targeting the C-suite. And a good example may be they understand when your executives are traveling. Then they may create an urgent email that comes into your CFO or somebody they know cuts checks within the organization asking for a bank transfer on an emergency basis. A lot of times malware systems won't detect anything wrong with that. It seems like a perfectly innocent email, but it is socially engineered to get folks to take action where they should not be taking action. And it's really when people are caught up in the whirlwind of day-to-day activity just trying to get things done, occasionally that urgent email from someone at the C-suite level or upper management will prompt an action that is just, creates a bank transfer to a place where it shouldn't go. We see a lot of it as well with requested password resets and a link on a web page very much emulating what you might see on a Microsoft Office 365 login or a Google login. And these used to not be crafted in a very articulate way. Now they've become highly articulate, and the URLs are so similar that unless you really pay attention to what you're doing, you could fall victim to it.
That's a great point, Paul. And I'd add very quickly that nowadays security breaches and cyber attacks generally take a layered approach. So the first thing might be just trying to establish some relatively innocuous backdoor into maybe your demilitarized zone or just outside your public network area, and then leverage that to be able to send emails that, to your point, not only are very professionally crafted, but for those of us that might dig into the next layer of technical detail, see information that suggests it comes from within the network as well, when in fact it's being launched from a point that's been compromised you may or may not be aware of. And that complicates the ability to recognize that threat sometimes.
It really does. And the threat actors scanning every website, every piece of information out there, they're able to craft very convincing messages that will typically make it through some level of security and end up causing a lot of trouble for folks. Well, let's move on to our next topic area, which is really the people aspect of data security, which is really the main target of what these threat actors are going after. And our next poll question focuses on identity theft. This could seem kind of obvious. It's almost an automatic yes for a lot of people in this scenario of ever being a victim of identity theft. And it's an interesting occurrence in that even some of the biggest security companies out there or holders of key information, such as credit bureaus, have been breached in this regard. So it's almost if nothing is safe, but we're very curious to see everyone's experience in the audience today as to whether they've personally or a family member experienced a identity theft incident. When we talk about people and information security, it all boils down to personally identifiable information. And really, at a high sense, that is any information that can identify one individual over another. But really, in practice, it spans a very wide range of things beyond just name and date of birth and address. It extends to financial data, family and relational data, and if anyone in the audience has used any of the kind of people search tools that are freely available on the internet right now, you can discover that you can find a lot of information for a very small price. Jim, how about some additional background on PII and how that's evolving as something to be paid more attention to?
Absolutely. And as someone who has personally had to deal with a breach of his personal information and identity theft, both as a government employee with government identity systems, as well as a private citizen, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. First of all, I'd point out, for the sake of everyone involved in relocation, that all 50 states have some form of privacy and security breach information laws on their books, and that each of them define PII in general senses, but the definition around what is to be protected is continuing to evolve and growing in importance. In the sense of what's called data loss prevention, which is it's part of the discipline of information security, PII can be collective information. It's perfectly understandable to traditionally be dealing with single paper forms that have name and address, and maybe social security number, phone numbers, and that sort of thing. But in the collection of electronic data nowadays, part of the challenge is what we would call cumulative information. Maybe one document has a name on it, you wouldn't necessarily be concerned about that. A separate document has address or other information, and that document in and of itself wouldn't be a concern, but it's the aggregate and the ability electronically to aggregate that data that raises more concerns about PII. And then another thing, I think, with regards to relocation, recognizing a lot of people on the phone are not only in the relocation business, but relocated themselves, you're kind of a captive audience. You're packing up the dogs, the car's ready to go, the Jeep Wagoneer's loaded down with the kids, and you have to sign these last forms in order to make sure that your household goods are relocated on time. And you don't really have a chance to pause and say, hey, could we go over your privacy protection information and how my PII is being protected? You got to sign the form and roll. And so, again, as we pointed out, that relationship in the supply chain between vendors and vendors' vendors and how each of them are managing your information suddenly is less of a concern than just the necessity of getting the work done. And that trades security for convenience. Also, there's just the issue of role-based security, which is there is a tendency in many systems to just kind of default that, well, if we're all involved in this together, we all have access and we're all trusted. But in fact, you might be able to get into considerations that say, hey, this individual as part of the relocation process doesn't have to know every element of personal information involved with the client. Whereas obviously at an administrative level or management level, at Paul's level, that sort of thing is more prevalent or more of a requirement. And so setting policies around what we call least privilege and making sure you're protecting that information needs to be considered. And then just lastly, training, because training has to be a factor as well. Paul, any other things you wanted to add to that as well, sir?
Yes, absolutely. I think when we look at this voluntary versus captive concept, for example, when you apply for a mortgage loan, you're picking your mortgage lender, you're developing a relationship, you're checking a privacy agreement, and you're voluntarily going in and providing that information to them. Really, when you're in the relocation space and when your company is using an RMC, there really isn't a question as to whether you want to give your information or not. You've already submitted your information. You are essentially captive and in many ways may not have complete visibility to the relative privacy of that information. And what I like to consider in the RMC business is we're at kind of PII junction. We have a ton of PII coming in from clients, and then we're redistributing that personally identifiable data out to supply chain partners. And the real trick there, which is what you touched on, was role-based security, and just exposing enough personal data to provide the service through the supply chain, only exposing that data at the appropriate time to the appropriate folks in the appropriate way. And that's something that we really pay a lot of attention to make sure there's no way that information can get compromised because it was just left out in the open for some period of time or not to the right people. And that's where, also going back to the training point, very, very important, because nothing is more true in data security, especially when it comes to human behavior, where you're only as good as the weakest link. And it only takes one person, using the same password for every account they have, or unwittingly clicking on something to expose an entire organization. And those types of situations can spread rapidly and get out of hand quickly. So, I think a great practice, and we see it a lot, we do it ourselves internally, is perform email phishing tests against our user base so we can see who's clicking on a phishing email. And of course, when you click on something, you get additional training beyond just standardized security training. And that goes a long way to raising the level of awareness for everyone here in our office. And also, they take that home with them. And they'll use that same security mindset when it comes to logging into anything else on the Internet. We'll move on to our process area, and we'll start with a poll question. Does your organization regularly perform security audits of their RMC and their supply chain partners? Folks may or may not know the answer to that. A key component to good security is to inspect what you expect, and that has to be done through regular security auditing. If folks answer no or you're not sure, that's not necessarily a bad thing, in that organizations, when they perform these audits, it's not necessarily an advertised function of the security team. You don't necessarily want threat actors to know who's auditing your information, how they audit it, and even more importantly, if they find any items for remediation, that those remain highly confidential to the enterprise. But we are curious to see, for the folks out there who do know, is this happening on a regular basis, and what does that look like? One of the biggest threats we see are to internet-facing assets. That seems to be the easiest attack that any of the threat actors can take. And that could be web portals that folks are logging into, or mobile apps that are provided by the RMC or supply chain partners. And it's very important that all that technology is developed through a set of standards. And as you can see on the, our slide here, we talk about some different background checking and some different things. One tool that we use that's called Security Scorecard assesses any domain name for any type of vulnerability on the internet. And there's a lot of tools out there like that, but we want to approach any supply chain partner as if you would run a D&B on them. We also want to run a security scan on them. So we can understand what they look like to the outside world and how secure the data would be should we use them in our supply chain. Jim, can you speak a little bit to security testing and what that looks like in the market today?
Absolutely, sir. When we first started working together with Paul, as noted on the slides, the first step, of course, is just the audit and the assessment to kind of understand where you stand from a landscape. And Paul has rightfully been emphasizing the people, process, and technology flow that we're working through here. As he mentioned, there are tools available, a wide range of tools available that, such as the security scorecard mechanism and others that can give you a good perspective on your current technology posture. In addition, you take a look at your process level in terms of what sorts of standards are you following for your information security. Paul rightfully chose ISO 27001, which is an international security management system standard. The nice thing about that, especially from the CapRelo perspective, is when you're dealing with relocations that are international as well as national, and you have considerations for international law, just international contracting, the ISO standard is internationally recognized and has been adopted, and also helps promote things such as the general data protection regulation for privacy information. And it's a good position for a lot of relocation companies that have to consider international moves to be considered. There are tools available for being able to evaluate and assess your policies and procedures around the ISO standards. And then from a people standpoint, how well are your people trained? What sort of training mechanisms are in place? Paul mentioned using things like phishing exercises to be able to ascertain how your people understand and are aware of recognizing phishing emails. In addition to that is just training on what laws and regulations that have to be followed, and policies and procedures for handling personal information and using your information systems correctly. And from a security scorecard standpoint, Paul, I think you also touched upon the importance of data disposal, which is, not only protecting information while you have it, but the process involved to properly purge that data or remove those data records when necessary, so you're not holding information too long. And I think you have experience with that as well, Paul.
Yes, we do. And the way we see these standards pushing down, a lot of times when you start a relationship between two organizations, it begins with an RFP, and there's a lot of questions, and a lot of times you may get a boilerplate security questionnaire that is typically based around and built upon the ISO security standards. And that is really because that's part and parcel of most organizations' security practice, and it's best practice. You need to see a cascading effect there, because your RMC should also adopt the exact same standard, And likewise, all their supply chain partners need to adopt that standard. And one of the challenges is that these are standards in the marketplace, and we talked about audit. It's almost you'll never quite be in 100% alignment with that standard because the world is ever changing. So it takes vigilance and a continual program of audit and assessment to see where some holes may have opened up and how those should be addressed and how urgent it is for those to be addressed. And it's very challenging in the RMC world because you may have 100, 200, 300, up to 1,000 supply chain partners that are doing business to varying degrees with you, and you really need to investigate each one of them, not just from a contractual sense to have the right T's and C's in place, but also from an actual in-practice sense. And that's where something like a security scorecard audit goes a long way to kind of taking the temperature of the relationship when it comes to data security. And, you know, we talked about data disposal, and sometimes that's even more important than acquiring the data is what are you going to do with it, how long does it live, and where it actually ends up, and when is it disposed of, and even more importantly, how can you prove that the data has been disposed of? So you really need to look at a certified destruction program so it's verifiable that the information has been erased. That goes a long way towards kind of closing the final chapter on having someone's PII. Jim, any other comment there on outside security? I think we fairly well covered that.
Absolutely, and I think we just both agree on leveraging at some point, perhaps first as a wellness check, and then consistently from there, some degree of review or third-party assessment to be able to help you connect the dots in terms of the solidity of your information security program.
Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense, and you know we've gone through a rebuild many times over the years of information security policy, and sometimes within the security world, volume is kind of key. You need a very large, thick policy that is a couple inches thick. But it's really the summarization of that policy and being able to pull the proper processes that are fully auditable out of it and be able to show that to clients, to government organizations, and make sure your supply chain has the same thing. Moving on to our technology piece here, a poll question for everyone as relates to social media. Of course, social media is monstrous. It's a large part of folks' lives at this point. Curious as to what kind of part that plays in your organization's recruiting process. And it's, I know, just talking about our recruiting process, it's key in finding folks, applicants who are interested or we're interested in. And on the flip side, it is also key in understanding someone's background. There is a perception out there, especially with folks who are just entering the job market, of very little expectation of privacy in that they have grown up within the social media world, and it would almost seem alien to them not to post every detail and aspect of their lives online for all to see. And keeping your information secure, whether it's Facebook or whether it's Instagram or Twitter or any other number of sources, that's a lot of security policy and settings to keep track of. And a lot of times that information can leak out via social media and may portray things about folks that they wish would be forgotten about. But of course, as they say, the internet is permanent, even if you delete things. Moving on to the technology piece, Jim, I know we talked about ISO, and a newcomer on the scene, a relative newcomer, is GDPR. for the European Union and some impacts there. We know that there's new legislation coming out in California as well. What are the main tenets of GDPR, and how did that change the game that we're in right now with regards to PII and how it gets safeguarded for individuals?
Absolutely, Paul. That's a great question. So the traditional privacy laws, both the state level and, of course, the National Privacy Act, have historically put in what I'd call the traditional sort of fortress protections for information. It was recognized that you were being entrusted with sensitive information and personal identifiable information, and that some sort of security standards had to be put in place that would protect that information. What you start to see in a change with things like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and possible changes in legislation in the U.S. that kind of mimic that, is also being held accountable and understanding just what data elements you have for individuals that could be considered part of their PII, and what your plan is to either safely dispose of it, or if someone inquires about them and saying, hey, what information do you have about me, your ability to report accurately and timely what that information is, and if they want it back or want it disposed, your ability to provide them confirmation that the information has been returned or removed. That's kind of changing what I'd call the dimension of how information is managed in not quite such a static fashion. And your comments about social media are excellent as well. And I'd add to that, as you have here on the slide, the use of mobile apps and mobile technology. People are now more used to putting their information to social media, or tweeting a photo of doing something, and they're used to doing it more from their phone than they are from a traditional laptop or desktop. The same thing applies to the relocation workforce. Just using a healthcare example, there are plenty of anecdotes of violations of healthcare privacy law called HIPAA, simply because somebody put a tweet photo up of, hey, I love my job when I'm here in the operating room working with a medical team, but they happen to include the picture of a patient or some identifiable information as well, which was a violation of the law. You can have folks that are on the job and involved with relocation that may be leveraging their social media in such a way that inadvertently is sharing information about their customers and clients that aren't necessarily appropriate. Also, as we saw with things like the WhatsApp vulnerability this week, social media applications on mobile phones represent that new attack vector that we spoke about earlier, and the concept of what is the next way to try and penetrate the castle walls. The move away from that information being stored in paper and now being almost entirely digital. And again, that security versus convenience balance, that people don't want to have to fill out 12 sheets of paper to do something, but would rather walk through a mobile app to get things arranged. And what does that mean in terms of protecting that app and keeping that app secure within the phone type environment? All of those are starting to change with the type of legislation out there for how information is collected and protected at each of your respective relocation sites.
Yes, I know with GDPR, when we first started our preparation and compliance exercise for GDPR, we soon realized that the easier path was to treat all information as if it was GDPR related. And that way we gave an added level of protection even where none was warranted or required necessarily for domestic data. When you think everything is under GDPR, it just makes life a little bit easier that way. You touched on the right to be forgotten. You need to be able to show folks that their information's been removed and be able to prove that. And that's just good practice all the way around. When it comes to the mobile app piece, and we touched on mobile devices a bit, that cannot be understated in terms of an organization's ability to control the mobile device arena within the company itself when those devices are connected to the corporate network. I know we have a lot of controls in place in our organization, all the way to, we can disable certain functions of a mobile device while it's connected to a company network. It's important to know that company data, when it's on a mobile device, especially if it's a bring your own device scenario for employees, that information is encrypted and it's removable. That's evolved over time, and it used to be that the only way to really get the information off the phone was to completely erase it, or as we would term in technology, bricking the phone. And that's not necessarily a nice thing to do because it gets rid of, non-secure data as well as secure data. Now it has a little finer point to it, and if companies are doing it the right way, they can go in and remove the data that is just sensitive to the company or to the relocation without destroying anything else. And it makes for a better mobile device experience all the way around. Jim, when it comes to, let's say, what we've termed on this slide the millennial challenge, we talked about no expectation of privacy with some younger folks. How does that really impact the new legislation out there? If let's say someone really isn't necessarily concerned about anything being private, are the regulations there to kind of protect them against themselves?
There are, and that's a great point, Paul, because as we mentioned around the use of social media, with the new generation that doesn't necessarily recognize that expectation for privacy, the relocation companies, as stewards of those information, of that personal information, may find themselves in a role where they're advising their customers, hey, you're entitled to this sort of protection, and let me spend a few minutes explaining to you how we protect your data and protect your information, because it may not be something that's coming to the younger customer's mind immediately. But as a relocation company, as we've heavily emphasized, there are rules and regulations nationally and internationally that you have to follow. And so it helps you and it helps the customer to spend a few minutes explaining what kind of protections they're entitled to and how your information security system is protecting them, as well as the information security arrangements that you have with your vendor partners. So that's a great point to consider. We're now a bit in a role of helping the customer understand what their security and privacy is that they're entitled to, as well as enforcing that as part of our system.
It makes a lot of sense. We're at the close of our technology piece of the discussion, and if folks have been putting questions in, we would love to be able to move to the Q&A portion. I'm sure folks have a lot of questions about data security, and we can most likely help.
Absolutely, and you can just enter a question into the Q&A chat box, and Paul and I will pick up on it and happy to provide a response for the audience.
Right. Actually, I'll start off with a question. You know how, like, when you're downloading, apps or agreeing to terms and conditions, are there any? And sometimes you're not real sure if what you're downloading is really secure. Are there any warning phrases or language you should look for, in the terms and conditions where you're like, okay, no, I should not download this, or I should not accept this, this app's, the information that they want to collect?
I would approach that first. If that app, and of course there's a couple of different worlds you might live in there. One, if you're living in the Apple world, the vetting of any application available for an iPhone or an iPad is pretty thorough. Folks need to be able to submit that. It needs to be reviewed by Apple for both security and functionality. So I always have a greater level of confidence of something that might be in the App Store for Apple When you get into the Android world, things can get a little squirrely because some of those same controls are not necessarily in place. Jim, I don't know if you concur with that opinion. What do you see when it comes to app security in that regard?
That's a great question, and as some people may have seen, there's some controversy going on with the iPhone App Store simply because of the process by which it allows apps to be put into it and whether or not it has a monopoly. But they have traditionally had what is considered a higher level of app vetting in the Google Play Store for those who are in an Android environment or probably have a Samsung. There have been concerns in the past about whether or not they were following the same process and procedure rigor for trusted, reliable applications. And so it falls on the user or in the app developer to make sure that they're subjecting their applications to thorough review and identifying and eliminating vulnerabilities when they may come up. And then secondarily, upon the application user to look to see, does the application appear trusted? Is it from a known source? In the case of an application provided from the relocation company, part of the easy way around that I would offer is, talk to your clients about the fact that you offer a mobile app and then direct them to a specific location where they could download it securely or safely through the App Store, include things like logins and passwords and demonstrate that the app runs securely in the environment they're in. Again, it becomes the opportunity for the relocation company to demonstrate how they're stewards of information by providing secure mobile apps for their use.
Great, thank you. I do have another question here. It says, how can we start with being ISO 27001 compliant as a small business to be able to pass the RFP initial questions?
And Paul, I'll be happy to take that since we're working on that together. The first step that Paul and I had was to conduct a high-level assessment within a short period of time, reviewing people, process, and technology against the major requirements for the ISO standards. The groovy thing about ISO 27000, as with all of the other ISO standards, is it leads to a formal certification process involving a formal certification audit. That's something Paul and I are still working on down the road, but is certainly achievable, but it doesn't have to be an immediate concern. So if you do your own investigation and take a look at the scope and breadth and requirements for ISO certification, it can appear a bit daunting. But the first thing from just an operational security and risk standpoint is let's just conduct that benchmark assessment to understand where you're at, what type of low-hanging fruit could be addressed, and what you can do for developing your people, your processes, and your technology in keeping with the ISO standards, and ultimately work your way to certification if you desire. But if nothing else, you have a demonstrable security program that you can point to standards that you're leveraging.
Great.
Agreed, Jim. I think there's the set of required elements where you need to check those boxes. And the most important thing is you're identifying processes to address each one of those security elements. And then you can prove those processes out to show that they're actually working and they're providing the feedback that they're designed to provide.
Great, thank you. So I guess this is sort of a question for Paul. CapRelo has their strict standards for data security, but how do you hold your third-party suppliers accountable for that same standard?
In terms of the third-party suppliers, it's a multi-step process. So if we go back to the very beginning of the relationship with that supplier, certainly there has to be the contract in place, and embedded within that contract would be our security standards, our right to audit would be included. And if that supplier is going to be within the EU realm, all of the GDPR standards are also included in that document. So there has to be that first part. So contractually there's teeth so that if we need to audit, if we need to go in and address any issue, we have all those contingencies built into the relationship. Then there's the actual working relationship, and there it requires an assessment of what is going to be the data that we are going to exchange with the supplier and how will it be exchanged. What we would always prefer to do is do that electronically via secure web service, and if we have an order for them or something for them to fulfill, we shoot that right over. We also have links for those supply chain partners to come back into our web-driven system, and all that needs to be vetted in terms of what data is exposed, when it is exposed, and whether they can actually save that data into any of their native systems. When we look at that relationship, we try to limit as much as possible the data that can be left behind at a supplier. And for the data that is left behind, what is the retention schedule, what is the security, and then ultimately, how is that data disposed of? One thing that struck me when we were talking about apps and that personal data and where it goes, what's really important to us in all these relationships is to make sure there's no remarketing going on of any of the data. And that's, makes the internet wheels go around for the most part for Google and every other purveyor. Of course, in the RMC world, it's all about no remarketing and the fact that everything is kept private. And we just want to make sure our supply chain adheres to that concept as well.
Great, thank you. And another question, where would we find our state's privacy laws? I don't know if you can answer that.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to.
Okay.
I saw that question and I was scrambling because my laptop's currently locked into the panelist presentation mode. But I think I shared with our team here, there are a couple of sites, and I hate to just say, go Google state privacy laws, but unfortunately I'm not able at the moment with my laptop to insert a link into the chat box to share for all the attendees, but I'd be happy to do so afterwards. There's one or two in particular that keep track of what the current state of the law is in every state, as well as help keep you abreast of what potential legislative changes are. As I mentioned, there has historically been 50 states have had laws on the books concerning personal privacy and information breach notifications, but all 50 just about are evolving newer and stricter ones. And afterwards, I'd have to share a website I remember I looked at in particular that graphically depicted the United States and broke down graphically on the map which states were considered stricter on a scale of 1 to 4 and which were considered more lenient in terms of specific legislation information. And they ranked that on the basis that you're a 4 if you called out more specific PII data elements that required protections, if breach notifications required a shorter period of time, like 12 or 24 hours, or how that process took place and how rigorously you had to adhere to it, up to those other states that they were a little more looser just in terms of saying that should be protected, but they aren't quite as specific as to what the requirements were or the penalties were. But I'd be happy to share that after the fact as well.
Right. I guess this would be a question for Jim about what do you think a policy should be for employees in terms of security training? Should it be, that they how much training should they have? Should it be every quarter, every 6 months, yearly training? For just updates. What what are your standard suggestions for training employees?
That's a great question, and in fact, we're in a bit of a midst of what I call a revolution for cyber workforce training. It's kind of on the lips of every major corporation and has been getting a lot of attention both in the state and federal government in recognizing that our workforce doesn't have all the cyber skills it really requires. So programmatically, new efforts are coming along that start obviously with things like training for specific skills that involve information security within your environments and within your information technology organization. Next is training at the executive level, which should be done at least once a year with quarterly reminders or periodic updates. And then the same thing down at the daily worker level in terms of annual training that should be held and identified, and that includes some sort of acknowledgement. You want to have written acknowledgement as part of their HR records that I have been through this training and I have been advised what the requirements are, because we are like it or not, getting into the day and age when individuals have to be held accountable for their following company procedures because the companies are being held for liability if the information isn't protected. And then part of what we call awareness and traditional, posters, messages, banner ads, designated a cybersecurity awareness day and have trivia questions and games, things that help keep the topic of security fresh on their mind.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. Big thank you to both Paul and Jim for sharing your insights with us today. I think we've pretty much come to the end of the questions. I would also like to offer a very special thank you to CapRelo for their sponsorship of this webinar. You all have been a wonderful audience, and I hope you've enjoyed the program. If you have any other questions, please insert them now, and I'll make sure that Paul and Jim get them. Just a quick reminder, keep an eye on the Worldwide ERC website. We are constantly adding new events. Watch your emails for a copy of the presentation today. You could also access the recording. All that information will come to you from messenger@webex.com. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a great afternoon. You may now disconnect.